Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking just after the release of a report that was 7 years in the making, 4 times more words in it than War and Peace, I'm told. It's the Chilcot Inquiry, and it points the finger squarely at Tony Blair and at the intelligence and military apparatus in Britain over the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the lack of a plan for the post-Saddam Hussein era. We're talking about it in the company of Chris Nineham, founding member of the Stop the War Coalition, alongside the likes of the current Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He is with us from London. From New York, Nora Mulready, a Labour Party member and political commentator. Welcome back as well to Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil. He is the Paris bureau chief of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and France 24 senior correspondent Melissa Bell. Just as Britain these days is, because we have to talk a little bit about the timing of when this report comes out, just as Britain is fretting over Brexit, over its role as the United States' gateway to Europe, there were those back in 2003 who argued that to let George W. Bush go it alone would be a betrayal of the special relationship. Not true, concludes the Chilcot Inquiry. It says in its findings that Blair was right to weigh the possible consequences for the wider alliance with the U.S. very carefully, but it also says that if the U.K. had refused to join the U.S. in the war, it would not have led to a fundamental or lasting change in the U.K.'s relationship in the U.S. And we can all recall that before bypassing the United Nations veto at the Security Council, Bush and Blair were stopped there by France.
C'est qu'un usage de la force serait si lourd de conséquences pour les hommes, pour la région et pour la stabilité internationale qu'il ne saurait être envisagé qu'en dernière extrémité. Et c'est un vieux pays, la France d'un vieux continent comme le mien, l'Europe, qui vous le dit aujourd'hui.
Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, at the time, did you think there were no weapons of mass destruction?
No, the idea was that whatever programs were active, whatever stockpiles there could be, and the reason why there were inspectors in Iraq was precisely to clarify this, did not justify a military intervention. That was what I thought at the time, and that was the position of, independently of my own personal thinking, the position of a vast majority of countries in the world, including members of the Security Council. By the way, that explained why it was not about a veto against the US and the UK. There was nothing to veto because there was no majority in the Security Council in favor of going to the war. That is why the US and the UK eventually just stepped back and went around the Security Council.
What has it done for the respective relationships of the UK and France in relation to the United States?
I don't think that particular episode was, in spite of all its magnitude and the catastrophic consequences that it had, and it still has, as far as I am concerned, I don't think that changed the relationship. There was, at the time, a lot of tension, more between the US and France. There was all this thing about French bashing, calling French fries freedom fries, etc. That didn't last. That lasts too long, but it didn't last very long. And now you have an excellent relationship, including on highly strategic issues like Iran, on military affairs. And with the UK, obviously, that also brought tensions. But at the same time, the UK and France already were working together, for instance, on solving the Iranian nuclear program threat through negotiation that time, trying to find a negotiating agreement, a political solution, and not precisely to avoid the use of force.
Melissa Bell, what potentially has a bigger impact on that special relationship between the US and the UK? Military operations like the one in Iraq in 2003 or the Brexit?
It's difficult to say, and of course the two were linked rather cleverly today. I don't know if you listened to when Tony Blair spoke. One of the journalists asked him, is the suspicion that the masses, so this is more from the UK perspective, that the masses have with regards to the elite and that have led to the Brexit vote, can we not trace them directly back to the fact that the British population was always suspicious of your taking us into war, and in the end has been proven right in those suspicions. So more a question that perhaps the idea that he had misled the British population, was that not the beginning of everything that has followed? So of course this is being considered in a very particular context. The Guardian put it today, if the Brexit is the most momentous political event since World War II, then the invasion of Iraq comes a very close second. So we're looking back on history 13 years ago in a context that is very particular and where recent events almost trump what went on. And yet so much flowed from that decision back in 2003, nationally, regionally, internationally, that of course the two have been raised in the same breath throughout the course of the day.
Norm, already, do you take the point that a lot of the vote for Brexit was rage against the elites, and that part of it is down to a credibility cap that some say was born with the decision to follow George W. Bush into Iraq?
No, I don't know that. I think although I do think you can trace the origins of the Brexit vote back quite a long way, although I would argue that actually it relates to politicians on both the left and the right basically riding the waves of political grievance within poorer communities, particularly in Britain, which voted disproportionately highly for Brexit. So just to give you an example, if as a community where, you know, there's high unemployment, and there has been for 2, maybe 3 generations, and you have politicians that come along and instead of kind of giving you a pragmatic and, you know, positive vision, and, you know, to try and, like, how can we get more jobs, how can we be more pragmatic about this, you know, how it turns into a scapegoating exercise. So either you're blaming immigrants, which a lot on the right do, or you're blaming Thatcher, you know, however many decades later. You know, that is completely irresponsible political action, either from politicians or from trade union leaders as well, actually. And things like this, is it any surprise that when people have this fed into them year after year after year, that actually, when given an opportunity to basically vote
right, so you're saying
against an elite,
the Brexit vote is you're saying a lot to do with domestic politics. Let's look at a reaction on the hashtag.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the hashtag F24 debate from former Conservative MP Louise Mensch. She says, "I stand with Tony Blair. Right decision. Liberated Iraq. Failure was not to plan peace. History will stand with Tony Blair, not the Corbyites," as she put it. Chris Nineham, let me ask you, this credibility gap, is it all to put at Tony Blair's doorstep? After all, there was a vote in Parliament back in 2003.
Well, it's not entirely the democratic deficit in Britain can't be entirely blamed or laid at Tony Blair's door, but nevertheless there can be no question that this particular decision was the moment at which the rift between the people living in Westminster, the Westminster bubble, the politicians, the political elite, and the people started to develop in a very serious way. And what is irresponsible is, first of all, for politicians to think that they have the right to ignore the will of the people, to ignore public opinion, but also to develop policy and to promote policy by lying and obfuscation and deception. And that's what the Chilcot report rightly says that Tony Blair did. So it can be no surprise.
In fact, it explicitly says that he didn't
lie. No, you're wrong.
No, that is a complete fiction.
It doesn't say that he didn't lie.
Isn't it amazing that the Chilcot? Isn't it amazing that Chilcot says exactly what he thought before Chilcot?
It said that he went to war. He took this country into war on the basis of supporting George Bush's plan for regime change, which he never explained to the British people. So he took us to war for one reason and told the people he was taking us to war for another reason. And it's that
can I
dynamic.
ask a question?
No, you can't interrupt
Yeah.
me. No, you can't. That dynamic explains the series of lies that Tony Blair told to Parliament about the weapons of mass destruction. He had to prove something that wasn't true in order to hide the fact that what he was really doing, as Chilcot says, he was following the timetable and the strategy of George Bush without telling us. So, which, by the way, and another element here which has to be taken on board, war for regime change is illegal under international law. So at the same time, he was lying to the Parliament and to Cabinet, actually, and to the British people, but he was doing so in pursuit of an illegal war. So why you possibly could believe that this kind of arrogance from the political elite is not going to create a deep disenchantment and a deep sense of betrayal amongst ordinary people in this country passes belief. And okay, we can, we can argue about the origins of it, but now, please, you as a politician, show some humility, recognise that a mistake was made, recognise that lies were told. Otherwise, this democratic deficit and disconnect is just going to continue.
All right, before I hand it back to Nora Moretti, let me just ask Melissa Bell. We heard Tony Blair. He answered reporters' questions at length today.
Nearly 2 hours of it.
Did he face the music?
It was fascinating listening to it. It lasted an hour and 50 minutes, about an hour of statement and then 50 minutes of questions from reporters. And I watched the whole thing and kept thinking, has he apologized? And I actually couldn't tell you even now whether he did or not. Of course, he expressed more sorrow, regret, and apology than ever you may know, but in the same breath said that he would make the decision again if he had to make it again, that he had made it in good faith, that that Iraq was a better place today, that the world was a better place without Saddam than it would have been had he left him in power. And so you had this very strange, almost, very emotional, but inconclusive series of statements, I think. For people listening, it was quite frustrating. It's very difficult to pin him down and to work out exactly whether he was apologizing or not. I'm still not clear about it now.
Nora Moretti?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I find very, very strange from people such as Chris there and the Stop the War Coalition, and who parade around their left-wing consciences, as though they are the absolute beacons of virtue in the world. But yet the idea of Tony Blair undertaking action to rid the world of a fascist dictator, they find that abhorrent. They find that unacceptable. And actually, they argue that they would find it more acceptable if it was, if there was if there'd been weapons of mass destruction, if we'd been subjected to, if we were under threat in this country. That's not left-wing. That's not internationalism. Internationalism is looking at people who are suffering around the world and reflecting on what you as an individual, you as a society, you as a country, including with your military, can do to help them. That's what this was about. Tony Blair trying to help them. So even if you take the premise of even if you accept the premise of what he said, that Tony Blair said that he was just supporting George Bush in order to undertake regime change, I mean, even if that was the case, why is that so disgusting? Why is that not laudable? Why is it not a good thing?
Well, first
to be
of all, because
prepared
it's illegal
to
under
rid the world of
international
a
law.
fascist dictator?
And
but
first
how
of all,
is there,
because it's illegal.
What is the left-wing principle? What is the morality behind your argument? There is no morality behind your argument.
All right, let me.
All you're saying is we should abandon them because
Chris
it's illegal.
Chris Neidham, before you answer, Chris Neidham, let's first of all the reactions coming in on both sides, by the way, on our hashtag F24debate. This one saying Tony Blair should be charged for deceit and undermining the UN Security Council decision. But let me just, before you weigh in, let me get your reaction to what David Cameron said. He addressed Parliament and explained how mechanisms for deciding foreign interventions have been reviewed since 2003, but added that Britain must not shrink from its role in the world. Let's listen.
We should not conclude that intervention is always wrong. There are unquestionably times when it is right to intervene, as this country did successfully in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. And I'm sure that many in this House would agree that there have been times in the recent past when we should have intervened but didn't, like in failing to prevent the genocides in Rwanda or Srebrenica.
Chris Neidham, let me ask you point blank. Are you proud of the fact that Britain helped to restore the duly elected president, for instance, of Sierra Leone, that they intervened in Kosovo, and do you agree with David Cameron? They should have intervened in Rwanda and at Srebrenica.
No, I don't, because I don't believe that, first of all, bombing and sending thousands of foreign troops into Western troops into foreign wars does anything other than increase the level of killing and the level of chaos. And I have, unfortunately, history
the British
on my side
were welcomed
here.
as heroes in Sierra Leone.
The reality of the situation in Afghanistan, the reality of the situation in Iraq, the reality of the situation in Syria and in Libya all prove that these Western interventions actually cause more mayhem and more chaos. And no one in the Labour Party or any other progressive party anywhere in the world should be under the ridiculous illusion that when George Bush made the decision to invade Iraq, he was doing it on behalf of the Iraqi people. The Republican president who has backed many different interventions in different parts of the world was doing this, as the British people in their majority believe, because he was interested in pursuing US interests, Western interests in the Middle East. It was a war essentially for oil. And so it's not an accident that these massive
But do you agree with David Cameron that there
interventions-
are times when it's justified, like, for instance, in Sierra Leone, where it should have been there should have been an outside intervention in places like Rwanda?
My problem is that I don't believe ever that bombing people in foreign countries produces liberation. I'm a Democrat. I believe that problems, however severe and however challenging in any particular part of the world, have to be resolved by the people themselves. That's my first point. My second point is, personally, I don't trust David Cameron, the Tory leader. I don't trust the Republicans in the United States. I don't trust the people, the neoconservatives, the most hawkish group of foreign policy advocates, really, that the US has ever seen, when they say ever that they have the interests of people tens of thousands of miles away. Because what they're doing, they are pursuing wars in the interests of their own geopolitical strategies. It was called, indeed, the neoconservative doctrine was called the project for the American century. That's what was behind the push to war after 9/11. And we really can't be naive here.
Right.
These people are not interested in defending people. They're not interested in liberation. They're interested in projecting Western power. And that's why we have to oppose them.
Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, let's talk about the consequences of Iraq on that score. We've seen it both in the United States, more hesitant when it comes to intervening in foreign conflicts after being bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see the conversation going on in Britain. Less Western intervention, a good thing, is what Chris Neidham was saying.
Well, what we've just heard is exactly why David Cameron warns that wants to tell the world that the UK is not shrinking and will remain a global player. I don't believe that foreign policy is only about military intervention. But I do believe that military intervention can also be a good thing. You don't have to bomb people just because you're intervening militarily. That's what the UN does. The UN sends soldiers, for instance, with a mandate to protect civilians. And one of the key issues is exactly that. Do we draw the lesson from that report that every military intervention is bad and doomed and has to fail? Or do we believe that we can actually use military force as a tool with a broader strategy? I just want to address the tweet on the failure to plan. I think that's a very dangerous way to see things. Thinking that it was actually possible to plan in a better way the post-war, the post-Saddam situation, I think is kind of a dream. That it was too a complex situation, too a tense situation, for that to be justified even with good planning. But you can have military intervention that does help in some situations.
Melissa Bell, before we go, one final historical precedent that we haven't talked about was the Suez Canal crisis. It was the 1950s. France and the UK were going into Egypt to take on Nasser, and it was the Americans who said, no, don't do it. And it sort of shook the psyche of both nations. They realized they were no longer these grand imperial powers, and they've never recovered since, in a way. Is it the same for the Iraq War? Is it one of these things where Britain has lost a little bit of its luster?
I think it has made a profound difference. And we've heard two arguments. One, and there are people who believe this, that no humanitarian intervention of any sort is ever legitimate and it should never be done. There are those who take the view that on Syria, for instance, in the early days, morally, it was the duty of the West to get involved and prevent the civil war from taking the toll that it's taken.
There are likely better cases than Syria.
The problem, it's the one that comes to mind, and I think
Central African Republic.
And I think there are others. The problem with the war in Iraq is that whichever side of that argument you stand on, whether you are someone who believes in intervention in certain cases or whether you're someone who doesn't, this has nailed it. I mean, in a sense, it made countries like the United Kingdom, and we saw it on Syria in the vote in 2013, reluctant to intervene because it was, and we've heard this throughout tonight's debate, whether we never really knew whether he went in to back the American need for regime change or whether he really believed there were weapons of mass destruction, that everyone had this sneaking suspicion even at the time of the vote that were never actually really there. The fact that this war, as catastrophic as it's proved, was based on such a flawed proposition, argued for in such a flawed way in front of Parliament, in front of the British people, forced down their necks on the basis of flawed intelligence and sexed up intelligence, has made the case for every other intervention all the more questionable. And I think that's the real damage that it's done, that there are times when intervention is called for, there are times when it's justified, there are times when the case that can be made for it is strong, but it's been very hard to make since Iraq.
Since 2003 in the
For that
Iraq War.
reason.
Melissa Bell, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, Chris Nynam for being with us from London, and Nora Mulready in New York. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Melissa Bell is still trying to figure out whether Tony Blair really apologized or not.
I think a lot of people are wondering that right now. It is the apology that he almost undid, really, when he went on to keep answering questions. A lot of people talking about that today. As for the actual Chilcot report itself, 2.6 million words in that, but there are 6 words, I think, that are going to keep on resonating. Those 6 words are, "I will be with you, whatever." This is the note that those are from, the note on Iraq, written by Tony Blair, sent to George Bush. It was written almost a year before the Allied invasion took place. In it, he goes on to say that getting rid of Saddam is the right thing to do, but then outlines the danger of what he calls unintended consequences, many of which, of course, we now know did go on to happen, including civilian casualties. The Daily Beast has been looking at these words in particular. He says this writer says, the 6 words, "I will be with you, whatever." The British Prime Minister sealed his fate with those, committed his country to a disastrous war, and ultimately wrote the phrase that will endure on his political headstone. Lots of people really talking about Tony Blair's legacy and the fact that really this is going to define it. This article...
Just a question on that, because he doesn't duck down a dark alley after the report's done. He stages the press conference and he answers all the questions and he hangs around until every last one is answered. Does that surprise you?
I think
or
it goes
that's
back to the
Tony
point
Blair?
that was made in the very beginning. It was so damning to him personally that really he had to stand up and speak. He was the man that everyone wanted to hear from since Jeremy Corbyn has issued this apology on behalf of the Labour Party. But at the time, we'd had Jeremy Corbyn speaking on behalf of the Labour Party in the Commons and not apologising. On the contrary, laying into him. He had to stand up and speak for himself. He was the man who was attacked most spectacularly in this report, who was taken on head on, and he had to answer back. He did it with loads of emotion as well.
Absolutely, and certainly the beginning of that speech was something that I don't think I've ever seen from any politician, let alone a UK politician. What is interesting in this Guardian article, it's written by a journalist called Sarah Helm, who said she overheard a telephone conversation shortly before the invasion took place between George W. Bush and Tony Blair. And it really is very interesting reading, because the US president told the Prime Minister Mr. Blair. He was ready to kick ass, and Blair laughed nervously and then talked about his own epitaph, perhaps foreseeing what was going to happen. Bush then urged what she refers to as the junior partner in this organisation to have cojones. Now, a lot of people have talked about Britain being the US's poodle, and this conversation really does seem to say that that is, or that was, the case at that time. Lots of different reactions online to this one. Remember that Blair said history will be my judge. Well, it's just happened, and the judgment is utterly damning. This one too from Tim Stanley. UN undermined, cabinet undermined. This is a damning indictment of presidential-style politics. And Gérard Araud, the French ambassador, says that, may I remind everybody how France was abused and denigrated for opposing the war. France was right. Not sure that it's quite the moment to be gloating. Final word on this, we can't expect much more than a short statement from George W. Bush. He's celebrating his 70th birthday, and I suspect it's no coincidence that he's doing so with wounded soldiers.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.